So Russ, different generations have interacted with cultural, moral issues in different ways. The millennials, for example, they have chosen to go after issues like poverty or sex trafficking, or in some cases even things like immigration. What do you think about this generation's approach to these types of moral issues?
Well, I think a mistake is the way that many people frame it, which is to say that millennials or the younger generation aren't concerned about issues like abortion and other things. I really don't find that to be the case. For instance, one goes to the March for Life, as I do every year in January, filled with very, very young people. And much of the vibrancy happening in the pro-life movement right now is happening among very, very young people who, many of them are recognizing I could have been aborted. They see themselves as part of an abortable generation. And so they're motivated there. I think what one does see is that there are a multitude of issues that younger people are concerned about and they're seeking to apply the gospel to, which I think is a very good thing. I think the danger that can happen, and this happened with a segment at least of an older generation as well, is that we need to speak comprehensively to all sorts of issues. Jesus cares about all sorts of issues. But we need to make sure that we're speaking with varying levels of clarity and authority. I mean, we already know that at the local level in terms of personal ethics. There are things that we will talk about in preaching and teaching very definitively. Somebody comes to me and says, I'm thinking about leaving my wife for my secretary. My answer is very definitive. No, you can't, you're not permitted to do that. Right. But there are all sorts of other questions where someone may come in and say, should I send my child to this school, or should I homeschool, or should I what? Where I'm not going to have as definitive an answer. I'm going to have certain principles that I'm going to put into place and then seek to apply it in the life of that person. I think the same thing applies when it comes to questions of justice and of public policy. There are some issues that we speak to very definitively, very clearly. We have biblical authority to those issues. There are other issues that we speak to in more general terms where we understand there are principles involved here and there are consciences that need to be shaped here, but the Bible doesn't have a specific answer to that particular question. So one generation, for instance, I remember when I was a college student, and there was a voter's guide. It was a Christian voter's guide, and it had the Christian view on abortion. I think there is a Christian view on abortion, but it also had the Christian view on a line item veto. I don't think there is a Christian view on a line item veto. Sure. That's a question of prudential judgment. And I think there are certain ways in which Christians can agree to disagree on some issues where we both have the same goal in mind, but we have different ways of getting there. So for instance, you may have one person who says, I really think we need to raise the minimum wage in order to provide a living wage for those who are working. Workman's worthy of his hire, biblical principle. Another person who says, no, I don't think we ought to raise the minimum wage. It's not because he thinks that we ought to grind the faces of the poor into the ground. It's because he thinks raising the minimum wage will hurt the poor because it will lead to greater layoffs and unemployment. Now, That's not a dispute between light and darkness. That's a dispute between two believers who both have the same goal, which is helping the poor, but who have a prudential difference on how to get there. So that means there's a different sort of conversation that happens between these two people than between those who would say, I think we ought to deny personhood to an unborn child or to someone that we deem to be a slave in an earlier generation. Those sorts of questions, we need to have a hierarchy of what it is we're talking about.
So then, are you saying it's not the case then that the millennials don't care about abortion? They do, but they want to go about it in a different way? Because they certainly seem to have gotten the reputation, at least, as if they don't care.
I don't think that's true when it comes to abortion. I think that millennials are very concerned about abortion, and in some ways more concerned than Generation X. When it comes to abortion. Now, when it comes to issues of sexuality, I think there is a difference. I think there are many millennials, particularly, who are squeamish when it comes to speaking about issues of human sexuality from a Christian perspective. And much of that has to do with the fact that I think they have, many of them have gay and lesbian friends, and they assume that speaking of a Christian sexual ethic means that I'm denouncing in some unkind way the people that they know. Now, of course, as Christians, we understand that when we're speaking of any sort of ethic, we're addressing all of us in that, and so we have to speak with what Jesus has given to us, and that squeamishness is not called for. And there really is no way, even if one wanted to evade that, there is no way to evade it. The biblical text is the biblical text, and the gospel is the gospel. So I think there is a temporary squeamishness among some millennials when it comes to that, but what I have found is that when those people find themselves in places of leadership, in churches, in community groups, in neighborhoods, in families, they have to speak to that. And so they recognize the Bible really does have a word to this. And in order for me to be able to minister to people, I can't avoid this issue. Because the consciences of people are already, Romans chapter 2, asking, am I going to have to give an account for who I am sexually and how I act sexually? So what does that mean in terms of the gospel? There's really no way to preach the gospel without addressing that issue. That doesn't mean that someone has to be unkind or hateful. Right. And it certainly doesn't mean that someone should be unloving. But it does mean that someone's going to be speaking a very difficult truth. Right. But the gospel is always difficult. I mean, what the gospel says is take up your cross and follow me. And one of the reasons I think why we're squeamish to speak that word in a sexual revolutionary sense to people who are bought into the sexual revolution is because we have forgotten that in so many other areas. We've assumed that Christianity means living a good, normal American life and just going to heaven at the end of that. When in reality, no one in first century Jerusalem or Rome or Ephesus or Antioch would have heard the gospel that way.
So do you think that we've done, for the last few decades, do you feel like we, the church, we Christians in this culture, have done a good job in interacting with the homosexual community? Or, in other words, could it be the case that this generation is hesitant to go there because they might equate that with a certain kind of behavior from the way Christians have done that in the past leading up to now?
It could be. I think that in too many cases, we've assumed that homosexuality is an issue out there in the culture, rather than understanding that this is an issue that is speaking within the body of Christ. And also, I think we've had an inadequate understanding of temptation as we're preaching and teaching through the issue of temptation. Some of that, I think, has to do with the way that we do testimonies, whether that is in a church service or whether that is in a video that we have as part of some ministry. We'll often find people to stand up and say, this was my life before I met Christ. Here's how I met Christ, and it was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day, as the old song puts it. Well, that's not what the Christian life is like. So when the guy stands up and says, I was a drunk, I came to Christ, I've never wanted another taste of liquor. Well, that may be the case for this particular guy, right. But even if it is, there's some temptation that he is facing, that he is grappling with, and the more typical situation is someone who stands up and says, I've come to Christ, I'm living out a life of repentance, which means I'm every single day struggling and wrestling with the desire to go back to drunkenness. That's a victorious Christian life. The Spirit is giving him victory over that temptation. Doesn't mean he's exempt from temptation. And so when we're speaking in terms of sexuality and saying the Bible is calling you either to marriage, we define what marriage is, union, permanent union of one man and one woman in a one flesh relationship, or to chastity. What we're not saying is that that's an easy thing. We're saying that is cross-bearing, that is difficult, but the Spirit of God is present. The Spirit of God is with you in conforming you into the image of Christ. I think we need to have a very realistic sense of what we're talking about. We're talking about sin, not easy answers. And I think some of our easy answers that we've given have led to a great deal of discouragement. That's not to say that that's the reason why millennials, some millennials anyway, are squeamish about sexual issues. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they've been living in a culture that assumes the values of the sexual revolution and sees anything else as bigotry. Well, what's the answer to that? The answer to that is Romans chapter 12, transforming of the mind rather than being conformed to this present age, which means strong teaching within churches that doesn't start in a lot of times in a lot of churches we start talking about marriage in premarital counseling. We need to start talking about marriage in the nursery.
Right.
As we're raising up children, to say this is what marriage is about. This is what it means for you to be a man, to be a husband, for you to be a woman, to be a wife. This is what marriage is about. And I think in time we're going to have to do that. The outside culture is going to force us to do that because we can't assume some cultural image of marriage on television anymore. It's going to be so contested that we have to present a different and compelling vision. I think that's going to be a good opportunity to articulate an Ephesians 5 understanding of marriage.